Yeah. Good morning. Merry Christmas. Yes, it's still Christmas. 12 days of Christmas. We're still going to January 6th, so we're still in the 12 days of Christmas. And just relax. Tony will be back next week. I know sometimes as Joel was saying, yeah, when you get 2 or 3 weeks in a row, you better do what? No, Tony will be back next week. At least that's what I've been told. Well, I'm talking about a balanced tension this morning, but I want to start out by talking about several years ago how my wife Connie and I went through the Financial Peace University, or FPU, of Dave Ramsey. And as part of that class, we rediscovered that she is classified as a nerd person, and I am classified as a free spirit person. In other words, as a nerd person, she is detailed, introverted, a planning person, while I, on the other hand, am a generalist, extroverted, and takes things as they come type of person. Because of these differences, there are times in our marriage that this causes, shall we say, some tension in our lives. Preach it, I'm hearing it already, yeah. For example, we have been privileged to have been on, my wife is already laughing, so it's like, yeah. We have been privileged to be on a few cruises through the years as vacations, but I want to tell you about one of our first vacations. My wife, as usual on these cruises, signs us up to go to the first sitting for the evening meal at 6 o'clock p.m., which means the doors open at 6 o'clock. We don't eat at 6 o'clock. That's just when the doors open, and we, along with several hundreds of others, go in and sit down to our table, wait for our waiter to come, and then finally order our food for the meal, which is a process of another 20 minutes after those doors open to take place. Now, you need to know also that it only takes 2, maybe 3 minutes to get from our room to the doors of those restaurants. So that's all background information. About the third night, my wife Connie is ready to leave at 5:30, a full 30 minutes ahead of time. Me? Some of you are already laughing. It's like you know what's coming. Me, I'm reading a book and thinking about getting ready. However, I look up and I see her standing at the door of our room waiting, looking at me and waiting, then asking in a way that is not derogatory, nor was it pleasing, "Are you coming?" To which I look at the clock and reply, "Yeah." And before I can say anything else, she says, "Well, we've got to go now." So I stop whatever I was doing and begrudgingly follow her out the door, but I'm a little hot on the inside. Because to me, it's still early. And in that 2 to 3 minute walk, I continue to get a little bit hotter. And I want to lash out. However, I'd been married at that time over 25 years, and I knew that would not help. So on the way down one of the stairs, I calm myself down, I pull her aside, and then as calmly as I can, I simply remind her, the doors don't open until 6 o'clock. It doesn't mean we have to be there waiting for the doors to open. Her reply is silence. She doesn't say anything, but instead, she gives me, join with me, the look. Doesn't matter if you're husband or wife, you know exactly what I mean when I say the look. So we continue on to the restaurant. We kind of enjoy our meal with very limited conversation, even with our table mates. After dinner, once she has cooled down, and we both have cooled down as well, we find a place where we can have a conversation about what had happened. And she begins to explain that she has a high anxiety about being late. And as we talk more about it, the better I begin to understand where she is coming from. And the more we talk, the more the tensions relax, and we're able to enjoy the rest of the night and the rest of the cruise. Now, I don't know about you, but it sometimes feels like my wife and I are trying to sail our marriage through a narrow passage between a large, dangerous rock on one side and a giant, fatal whirlpool on the other side, like Odysseus does in the Iliad. But to me, it's a great example of what we, as Christians, are trying to navigate in our own lives. Only instead of a rock and a whirlpool, it's do we abound in the Lord's work? Or do we abide in the rest of the Savior? Put another way, do we seize the day, or do we cease our work and allow God to bring rest into our lives? Where do you find the balance between reaching out to help others as God has called us to do, and yet pulling back and growing where you are in your rest in your personal relationship with God? See, a big part of me wants to abound, as Paul encourages us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, where it says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord." I want to work for the Lord. That's one of the reasons I got into the ministry. I want to develop the gifts God has given to me. And I enjoy the fire He gives me inside as I minister in a variety of different ways. When Paul says a couple of times, I'm being poured out as a drink offering, that's not some easy labor or when I feel like it kind of stuff. No, it's taking up the cross, something that is difficult sometimes, and abounding or doing what God has asked me to do. However, on the other side of my life, Jesus says in John chapter 15, verse 4, "Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. So neither can you unless you abide in me." And the word abide here means to remain, or to dwell. Today we might say it, this is having deep roots or being centered in God's ways. Jesus also says in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." See, this Jesus of the cross, who wants us to stand firm in His presence, also describes Himself as gentle and the Lord of the easy yoke. So, which is it? Can you feel the tension there? Maybe sometimes you do in your own life. Are we to be abounding in the Lord or abiding in His presence? And you can find people on either side of that equation. And I've struggled with this many times in my own life. When I was in full-time ministry, many times I was too far on the abounding side. But now in retirement, I at times feel like I am too much on the abiding side. Yet, as I look at the scriptures, I see Jesus lived with this tension of both throughout His ministry. There's a story at a time in Mark chapter 1, begins at verse 20. I'm just going to paraphrase it, where Jesus withdrew to the desert to abide with His Father. Then He plunged back into the city to abound in work. Then He withdrew to abide, But while he was abiding, he was accosted by Peter because Jesus had turned off his cell phone, and Peter couldn't text or ping him to find out where he was. Verse 37, Peter says, "Everyone is looking for you." And then Jesus says, "Let's go to another place so I can abound more." And Peter's going, "What about these people?" And you could tell Peter just couldn't figure it out right then and there. But thinking about all this, as we begin and looking into a new year in relationship to our church body and our own personal lives, many of us need to realize that some people just want to abide. For example, I've seen many a church that has gone maybe 20, 30 years or more without producing any fruit, people not being challenged, volunteers not trained, or resources not stewarded well. However, no one complains because it's peaceful. It's very social. Things seem to be going well. However, the truth is, people just get used to not abounding, just abiding. And in our search for a church here in Tennessee, we found a few churches that are like that. However, we also found a few churches on the other side where people are running around in frenzied activities, trying all kinds of new ministries and opportunities that seem to be the fad of the time. And as a result, they seem to be in a constant sense of exhaustion and burnout. They accomplish many things, but their spiritual life is dry. There's no real depth or mystery of God's presence. As I thought about this, I came to realize I really don't like either of those ways as the right way of living. So then, am I supposed to wrestle with this tension all my life? How do I make this work? Am I to live a life of tension? And then I realized and I learned that if I'm going to make this work in my life, I need to practice certain principles. Things so that I can have times when I both abound and abide. Striking that balance, or rather, striking a rhythm for my life. So I want to share with you today some of the thoughts on these 4 principles that I have found to be helpful in my life. And I hope they will help you as well. So let's look at these. Principle number 1. Focus your life on what matters most. John Ortberg calls it his WHAM list. W-A-M-M, not WWJD, or around here, WWDD, what would Dolly do? That's not what I'm talking about. 2 different acronyms. WHAM, W-A-M-M, is an acronym for what activities matters most. What activities matters most? John Ortberg says he makes this list every day and sometimes has to revive it even midday. John Maxwell, instead of an acronym of WHAM, he has 4 different quadrants for his day. There's the important, there's the urgent, there's the if possible, and there's the later. Doesn't matter who you are or what tool you want to use. The fact is, you and I need to be crystal clear on what is important and what is peripheral. What has God called you to have as the most important things in your life, and even for this particular day? Peter Drucker writes that recognizing what counts is a true contribution of life. Yet, it is the greatest challenge for people that work. If you and I don't focus on what matters most first, it is amazing how much time we can waste doing other things. It would, to me, I see that as dead leaves in the backyard. You know, they'll move around more than anything else in my backyard. The wind blows them this way, Whoops. The wind blows them this way, the wind blows them that way. They tumble, they bounce, they skip, they press against a fence, but they have no aim whatsoever. They are full of motion, yet are empty of life. I like how Friedrich Buchner said. He says, sloth isn't necessarily incompatible with heavy activity. It's failing to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. John Ortberg says it's like a kamikaze pilot flying 17 missions. Think about that one, huh? We need to look at what has God shown you and I to be what matters most for our lives at this point and this time of our lives. Focus on what activities matters most as God leads you each and every day. Even though we are all in the body of Christ, it's still going to be different for each of us every day. And that leads to principle number 2, because once you have your list and you know what you're to do, principle 2 says, I need to be fully present to God's call on my life right now. On that list, if you're going to do something, do that thing right now. Whatever it is that God has called you to do, you need to be fully present in that thing. That means devoting myself fully to the present task. It might be farming, it might be teaching, it might be selling or driving. Whatever it is God has called you and or me to do, we are to do it with our whole being. It means when I come home, I must learn the difficult art of leaving my work behind and being fully present with my family. And we need to understand that there are certain forces that keep us from experiencing this full presence in our lives. Many things trying to climb into our lives: ingratitude, irritability, tension, a chronic sense that there is never enough time. In other words, we let the urgent get ahead of the important. And it's just not that we wrestle with these interrupting forces. Sometimes we want to glorify them. We sometimes walk around with signs in front of us hanging over our shoulders of busyness or fatigue, overscheduling. It seems like we're making them important. You know, things like, I'm just too busy, or I'm tired, but I got a lot done. Dorothy Bass has noted that the fourth commandment is the only one that people, even people in ministry, commonly boast about breaking. And just so you don't drift away wondering what's the fourth commandment, it's remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And I'm not here to argue about Sunday being the only day of rest. I'm talking about having a day of rest. And more on that in a few minutes. But let me put it a different way. There's a story about a man who came home from work every day. And as he would come home, he would rub his hands on the bush just outside the door to his house, and then he would walk in. Every day he would do that. And one day a neighbor asked him about why he does that every day. And the man explained that when he gets home, he rubs his hands on the bush to transfer all of the worries, all of the stress, all of the problems of work onto the bush. That way he doesn't bring them into the house and cause tensions in the home or with his family, and he can be with his family. Then in the morning, on his way out, he rubs the bush again to retrieve all of those worries and problems, but he says, there never seems to be as many of them in the morning. We need to be present to God's calling for the right now of our life. When you get home, you need to be with your family, not your work. And I know from experience, it's hard to do. But we need to try hard, as our families need us sometimes more than the work does. Principle number 3, I need a good rhythm. I need a good rhythm. One thing we need to remember about the creation story is that God didn't get all of his work done at once. I mean, it wouldn't have been hard for him to do that. I mean, he's God. Yet we read how God created things for 6 days. 6 different days. And on the 7th day, he rested. See, God was establishing a pattern, a rhythm for people made in his image. God worked, and then when he was done, he rested. He celebrated what he had done. It even says that God says, it is good. And yet, God never burned out. God never said, thank me, it's Friday. I don't find that anywhere in the scriptures. But the same goes for you and for me. I need to have a rhythm that includes solitude and rest. But you and I have to work for that solitude. If you have to ask yourself, ask this question, how long will you wait till a free day comes along? The answer is probably forever, because if you wait for it, it's never going to come. Because you will always be busy with something. I mean, I hear this even in retirement. Retired people say, I don't know how I got anything done before I retired. We seem to fill our days with busyness and work. Doesn't matter who you are. You have to schedule solitude. Write it on your calendar. Protect it fiercely. Solitude and rest never volunteers in your lives. It needs to be drafted. Sometimes it might be a full day. Other times only an hour or two long here and maybe another hour or two long there. But you see, that's the real reason I took up golf. Because in the ministry, I could be on the golf course walking in part of God's creation with no phones to bother me. To this day, I still enjoy turning off and just ignoring the phone while I'm on the golf course. I used to tell my secretary, if someone calls me, tell them I'm in a conference with Mr. Green, and you're not sure when it'll be done. Those of you who play golf, you understand that one completely. But the truth is, we must make time for solitude and rest. Put it as part of your rhythm or schedule in life. Remember in Mark 1 when I was paraphrasing? Jesus was doing both. He was abounding and then abiding. And then abounding and then abiding. We need to do that too. We need to have that rhythm. Schedule it if you have to in your life. Principle number 4. I need to focus on my abounding where God has gifted and placed me. Not what others might be doing in their lives or what others say you should be doing in your life. I need to focus on my abounding where God has gifted and placed me. I admit, this was a struggle for me when I retired. As a pastor, I had no problems abounding, but I struggled with abiding. I had no problem abounding, as there are many things that a pastor is requested to do on a weekly basis. However, when I retired and moved here to a different state, I had lots of time to abide, but didn't know really how to abound. And as a result, I suffered from bouts of boredom and depression. to abide and abound in the correct way, I have to be clear about the gifts and the passions God has given to me. Not to you, to me. I need to know my gifts, and you need to know your gifts. What fills me with the joy of the Lord, I need to know. And I also need to know what drains me. I not only need to know my gifts, but I also need to know my human limitations. We have spiritual gift surveys to help us know what our gifts are. However, there are no surveys to help us find our limitations. Yet we need to understand what our limitations are for ourselves. My guess is that all of us have at least one limitation that is hard for us to acknowledge. At least I do. And when I try to pursue a task as if I don't have these limitations, I cease to abide or abound correctly. Some even call it burnout. Parker Palmer says that burnout isn't usually the result of trying to give too much. It's the result of trying to give what isn't really in me. For example, in my life, I know there are people that love going door to door and doing evangelism. That would drain me. However, I think going along with someone else who's doing that and encouraging them is right up my alley because I'm an encourager. That's one of my spiritual gifts. For example, when a pastor friend of mine was doing some evangelistic preaching on a mission trip, I didn't want to do that, but I was very filled with encouragement and joy as I would walk along the outside praying and encouraging him through prayer and by praying for protection and direction of words for him to say. I was energized and walked up and down the area just praying. And if you know this pastor, he preaches for a long time. See, we all have different gifts. Some of them are evangelism. Some are administration. Some are preaching, teaching. Some are giving. Some are prayer. You need to know the gifts God has given to you and to use them accordingly. If you don't know your spiritual gifts, then we need to talk. We can talk here in the church office or other people. There's ways that we can help you discover what those spiritual gifts are. So let me kind of review these 4 principles, huh? 1, focus your life on what matters most. 2, be fully present to God's call on your life, my life, right now. Make your list, and then when you get one, you focus in on that one. Don't get distracted. 3, don't forget to have a good rhythm. Good rhythm of both abounding and abiding. Number 4, I need to focus on my abounding where God has gifted and placed me. Now, by using these 4 principles, I think it'll be easy for us to maintain the rhythm between that tension of abiding and or abounding. However, please note, as a human, it's hard to have that perfect rhythm. As you can see by the 4 things there, it's very complex. It's not easy. The struggle is not to strive for power when I'm abounding, and it's also a struggle not to be completely passive when I'm abiding. What we are striving to do is to love in perfect balance. And this type of balance is more like a gyroscope on a string. You know, that perfect balance in doing that which brings production. Dallas Willard says it this way: doing the spiritual disciplines and having a life of living in the Spirit. This is kind of long, so it's going to be a few screens here. But bear with me on these. Dallas Willard says, but more than anything, and most important for our goal of understanding the disciplines for the spiritual life, we must recognize that Jesus was a master of life in the Spirit. He showed us that spiritual strength is not manifested by great and extensive practice of the spiritual disciplines, but by little need to practice them and still maintain full spiritual life. To have misunderstood this point was the fundamental and devastating error of Christian asceticism in the Western Church from the Desert Fathers up to the time of the Reformation. Yet when we look closely and continually at Jesus, we do not lose sight of this one fundamental, crucial point. The activities constituting the disciplines have no value in themselves. The aim and substance of spiritual life is not fasting, prayer, hymn singing, frugal living, and so forth. Rather, it is the effective and full enjoyment of active love of God and humankind in all the daily rounds of normal existence where we are placed. The spiritually advanced person is not the one who engages in lots and lots of disciplines any more than the good child is the one who receives lots and lots of instruction and punishment. I know Dallas Willard can sometimes get some deep, but let me put it this way. It's not, what I think he is saying is, it's not the spiritual disciplines themselves. It is the time with God through the Holy Spirit in the activities of our daily lives that creates spiritual growth. Spending time with God, abiding, allows us to do more ministry, abounding, but not so much that we forget to rest and abide. It is that balance, that cycle, that is tough to achieve and to maintain. When it is done correctly, you and I can rest appropriately and authentically. Plus, when it is time to do what God has called you and I to do, we can better understand how that yoke that he talks about in Matthew 11:28 is easy to wear, because it's from God. It's what God has made us to do. And balancing the two is difficult for our lives and sometimes even our marriages. The distractions keep coming at us. Yet in understanding these four principles, I hope it's something that will help you as you move closer to God in your everyday life in this coming year. Pray with me, would you please? Lord,